And now for today's program. Judge David Tatel served on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit from 1994 to 2024, succeeding future Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. After graduating from the University of Michigan and the University of Chicago Law School, he served as the founding director of the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law, and then director of the National Lawyers Committee. He headed the Office for Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare during the Carter administration, and then founded and led the education practice at Hogan Lovells, where he is now senior counsel. Judge Tatel, along with Dr. David Baltimore, co-chaired the Committee on Science, Technology, and Law from 2016 to 2023. He also chaired the boards of the Spencer Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Judge Tatel is the author of Vision, a memoir of blindness and justice. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment Magazine's opinion and books editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section, and she's won first place in commentary from the Religion News Association. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Studies Center in Washington, D.C., and is the editor of the book, Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Please welcome Judge David Tatel and Amy E. Schwartz.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for turning out or staying in on this extremely hot and muggy day in Washington, D.C., or wherever you are. Judge Tatel, thank you so much for coming on to speak with us and for writing this lovely book. I'm privileged to have known you for many years, and it's lovely to talk to you and to learn so much about your life.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. We have known each other a long time.
So
Yeah.
ever since you were in the education practice at
Yeah,
Hogan,
right.
Hogan and Hartson, and I was
Yeah.
reporting. Yes.
Right.
So I know you've had a lot of attention for this book. You've already done, I think you told me you've done 100 talks like this, which is
Yes.
pretty remarkable. I'm holding
Right.
the book up now in case anyone hasn't seen it. It's a beautiful book. And I hope we'll ask you a couple of questions. I hope today will not be exactly the same as all the other 100 talks. Somehow we'll try to make it fresh. So I wanted to ask you first. I know you've said writing a memoir turned out to be a very different experience from what you expected. Can you start this off by telling us what you wanted to accomplish by writing a memoir and what has surprised you about how it turned out?
Oh, they're very, very different. When I started working on the book, I thought that when you write a memoir, you tell your story. My editor, Little Brown, said, the calendar is your friend. And so start at the beginning and work through and tell your story. Well, it turned out to be quite different. Writing this memoir required me and my wife, Edie. We wrote a lot of this together. We've been married for almost 60 years now.
Wow.
To explore lots of issues that, although we had thought about during our busy lives, we just hadn't really probed. Questions like, why, when I was young and beginning to lose my sight, I hid it from everyone. And even once it was visible, I never talked about it. And spent a whole lot of time thinking about why I did that. Questions like, how did blindness affect our marriage? How did it affect our children? And the process of writing the book and talking about it was a revelation for me. It was quite an interesting, it was a learning experience. In fact, I say in the prologue of the book that the book itself is a coda to my adventure with blindness. Same thing is true with my views about the court. For 30 years, I was a busy appeals court judge, going from case to case. And while you have some time to think about trends, you don't really have the time to think deeply about your work and what you've done. And writing this book gave me an opportunity. It took 3 years, gave me an opportunity to reread my work and the work of the Supreme Court and refine my views about the court. And I'll just say one last thing, Amy, which is that the book the book came out just a little over a year ago. And since then, I've had hundreds of emails and notes, conversations. And this was the real surprise for me, with people who say, I read Vision and it tells my story too.
Hmm.
And these are from people who, not just people with a visual disability, but hearing and many other kinds of disabilities, which can be hidden. And it turns out that, what I did was human. Everybody that has written to me has said they too have hidden their disability. So not only was writing the book a revelation for me, but the aftermath has been even more profound.
Hmm. It's I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about the title of the book. I mean, the word vision,
Yeah.
how that, I mean,
Well, vision has lots of meanings to us. Sure, it has a standard meaning about vision, but you can have vision without sight.
mhm.
And going back to writing this book, the book was in a sense a visionary experience in terms of what I learned about myself and the world.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think that when you survey your life like that, it turns out there is a plot, right?
Yes, there's a plot. Now, I don't think it's a planned plot. None of this was planned. I mean, I use the phrase throughout the book, right time, right place.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of that in one's life. But I did see patterns that, in my professional life, for example, what struck me as I thought back over the years is how important role models and mentors have been to me. And I hope that comes through in the book. But, if you had asked me about this 10 years ago, what are the major forces in your life? I'm not sure I would have said that, but having had this time to look back, it's quite dramatic for me about how important these people were in my life. So
People who helped you, or people who sort of modeled,
people,
showed you the way.
yeah, people from whom I learned an enormous amount. But these are mostly lawyers.
Mm.
Leading members of the bar, starting with the Kennedy administration and especially Kennedy Justice, the Justice Department. These are people who I admired when I was a young lawyer, and through the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, I came to know and work with. And these were my role models. These were the lawyers I wanted to be like when I grew up. And not only that, they played a very important role in my career decisions. I consulted these people every time I made a decision about a career, and many opportunities I've had came from those mentors. And in fact, I think it's totally clear to me that had it not been for my work in the Lawyers Committee and all of these great lawyers I met, I wouldn't be on the DC Circuit today.
Is there a particular person, like a hero lawyer of a lawyer hero of yours?
Well, Robert Kennedy,
Hmm.
Robert Kennedy Sr., I should emphasize.
Got
Robert
it.
Kennedy, don't want any misunderstandings here. Robert Kennedy Sr. was just a great model for me as the Attorney General of the United States, particularly with respect to the enforcement of the post-Reconstruction Amendment, the Reconstruction Amendments 13, 14, and 15 in the South. I mean, what those lawyers at the Justice Department did, people like Burke Marshall and John Doerr and Steve Pollack, who had the Civil Rights Division, they were the best of the legal profession, as were the judges they brought their cases before. And then later in my life, Louis Oberdorfer, who was federal judge in Washington and one of my dearest friends, and maybe in many ways the most important mentor I had in my career. So, and also I'll just mention one other name, because sadly his obituary is in the New York Times today.
Oh, no.
Al Polikoff from Chicago, one of the great public interest lawyers. Like me, a graduate of the University of Chicago, just a great, accomplished public interest lawyer whose values, I mean, I remember the day I walked into Al's office when I was a young lawyer in Chicago. He was working on a big civil rights case, in Illinois, and he was surrounded by big law books. He was a regular lawyer, commercial lawyer. And I thought, okay, when I grow up, I want to be like Al Polikoff. And I pick up the newspaper today and I see his obituary. And everybody listening should read that obituary. He was a great lawyer.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, this is a little bit of a tangent from your book,
Yeah,
but we read all the time about everything that's being torn down.
yeah.
And I think we've almost forgotten to think about the way all this stuff was built up, the heroic lawyering of that generation is something we maybe need to think more about.
Amy, the Trump administration is attacking all aspects of that. It's attacking the laws under which civil rights cases have been brought for decades. It's attacking the major Supreme Court precedents, and it's attacking the lawyers who bring those cases. It's gone after. When I was running the National Lawyers Committee in the 70s, the big New York law firms were the firms we went to handle our big cases in Mississippi. The Jackson State case, the prison reform case, the highway patrol case. Those big law firms took all these cases and invested hundreds of hours, thousands of pro bono hours in those cases, and they won many of them. And now those are the same cases, the same law firms who the Trump administration attacked and then who settled with them and took and it's terribly upsetting and a real tragedy it's a tragedy for the rule of law. That's what it is.
Well, I was thinking we'd get to this later in the conversation, but since we're there,
Yeah, it's hard to stay away from it.
no, it is. I know
Yeah.
it pulls us all in. But
Yeah.
I mean, you've seen it be built, and you've seen it start to be, and you've seen it attacked, and you had literally a seat,
Yeah,
at court watching all this begin. Do you have any? What's your sense of like what's going to hold? I mean,
that is a really big question, and I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, I've seen a lot in my career. For example, 1968 was a dangerous year in our country. We had urban riots, we had assassinations, we had the election of Richard Nixon. It looked and felt, the anti-war movement, it looked and felt very dangerous. But the difference between then and now is that the checks and balances of our government worked. The courts and the Congress checked the abuses of the Nixon administration. That's what we don't have today. This is what worries me more than anything else, is that the checks and balances, which are so critical for protecting basic human freedom in our country, have frayed. So we have a dysfunctional Congress, perhaps even worse. We have an administration that's seeking to challenge most basic legal restraints on the presidency. And we have a Supreme Court that seems so far not especially willing to check it. In the chapter six, the last two major substantive chapters of the book are called "The Future of Our Planet" and "The Future of Our Democracy." And they're about how the Supreme Court has exercised its power over administrative agencies and voting to limit the effectiveness of the big independent agencies that are so important to our health and safety in this country, and limit voting rights. And the book concludes that the Supreme Court is itself a threat to our democracy. If I were rewriting it today, I'd have exactly the same chapter titles, but now the threat comes from the presidency. And the big question is, will the Supreme Court check him? Now, I think around the edges, at the most extremes, I think the court will do that. It's already unanimously prohibited the president from from deporting people without fundamental protections of due process. That was 9-0.
That was something.
Yeah, that was important. But most of the other cases that have reached the Supreme Court, where the lower courts have ruled against the administration, Supreme Court has reversed. And particularly with respect to presidential control over the executive branch, over agencies, the court's agenda is pretty much the same as the president's. And so I don't think the court will check the president's effort to gain more control over the executive branch. What will happen with the president's effort to control, independent entities like universities and law firms? We'll just have to wait and see. But I worry that we know the Congress won't check the president. In fact, the Congress is enabling the president. And the jury's out, as we like to say, about where the Supreme Court will be. I hope it will limit the president, but remember, this is the same Supreme Court that just a year ago issued the presidential immunity decision in Trump versus United States.
Right. That was after you wrote your book, right?
That was after I wrote my book. Yes.
Worse than you could possibly have anticipated.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah. That's and I will say the branch you actually inhabited, the federal courts, are kind of covering themselves in glory.
The district judges around the country are phenomenal. They have hundreds of cases, and they're doing the best job district courts can do under these circumstances. But all these cases are being appealed to the circuit courts. Right. And the circuit courts, thanks to President Trump's first term, are populated by large numbers of judges who are sympathetic to what Donald Trump is trying to do. So many of these victories that are reached in the district court are reversed in the courts of appeals, and those that aren't go to the Supreme Court and get reversed there.
Right. Well, yeah. So we'll see. So it's sorry, I don't mean to. I know we try not to be entirely political or even somewhat political on these talks. And I know you wrote this book not intending it to be primarily political, right?
Well, actually, I'm glad you asked me that question, because I tried really hard to ensure this book is not political. The book is not about the results of Supreme Court decisions as much as it is about the way in which the court decides its cases.
Right.
I've tried to help my reader understand that there's a big difference between the unelected judiciary and the two elected branches of government, and that the Supreme Court and the federal courts have to confine themselves to the judicial process. And what I've tried to do in that part of the book is explain why I'm so concerned that this Supreme Court has failed in that duty. And as a result, at least by the time I finished the book, was increasing its power at the expense of the other two branches of government, which is dangerous for a democracy. But it's not political. I don't talk about the motives of any of the justices. All my conclusions come from what they write in their opinions. I leave it up to other people to talk about motives. My book is based on the Supreme Court's opinions and what we can conclude from them.
Right. So you've set me up for really what I thought of as kind of my ultra nerd question. And again, I was thinking I'd save it to the end, but you've teed it up. So when you write, one of the things you write in your book, you talk about when you cross over from being an advocate, from all the years of being a civil rights lawyer to being a judge and having to sort of adjust to the kind of judicial mindset that you're talking about, where you really just look at what the law requires and not what you think should be the policy outcome. And one of my, I shouldn't say favorite, but one of the passages in this book that I really, really loved was how you and a colleague on the Court of Appeals exchanged 16 drafts of your opinion and dissent because you still couldn't agree. And you write, each time I read his dissent, I better understood his point of view and revised my majority opinion for the better. He did the same with his dissent. By our 16th go-round, we had narrowed our differences dramatically, but we still couldn't agree on the bottom line. Our law clerks thought we stopped out of mercy for them at that point. So what I want to know is, this is self-serving for all of us. What can you teach us out of that experience about reasoned disagreement? I mean, this is an era when we need that so much, particularly, I mean, we're trying to do that all the time at Moment, just like be reasonable in disagreement, not go 100 to 0 all the time. Do you have any words of wisdom on this?
Well, you know, one of the great things about the structure of our appellate courts is they have they're multi-member courts. It's not just one judge deciding the case. So judges on both the appeals courts and the Supreme Court have to reach agreement to issue a decision. And that's really important to the judicial process. But it only works if two things happen. It only works if the judges respect the rules under which they operate. That is, if they respect the language of the Constitution and the laws Congress pass, if they respect their own case law, their own precedent. In other words, if they respect those rules, they can manage their disagreement within that structure. It's when judges abandon that and bring to the court their own political or ideological views that it breaks down. The second thing that has to happen is that it only works if judges who are on a panel or on a court actually listen to each other. If actually stop and listen to what each member is saying. And that's what that little story about, that was Judge Stephen Williams. He was appointed by Ronald Reagan, had a very different policy view of the world, political view than I did. But we were great colleagues because in our cases, we went out to lunch a lot. We were friends, but that's not the kind of collegiality I'm talking about. I'm talking about judges who respect each other's views, listen to what the other person has to say, respond on the merits. And sometimes, Amy, even change your mind based on what one of your colleagues says.
Imagine that.
Yeah, it worked. It's my own worry is that's happening less and less in the judicial system. But the fact is, you know, you ask what lessons we can learn from it. I think a case like the one you just read from, that little summary you just mentioned, or many of the others that I and other judges have experienced over the years, what we call judicial collegiality, is a great model for the rest of society. Mm-hmm. But it really doesn't require anything more than respecting each other's views and listening. And I can't tell you how important the listening is. You know, you have to listen to someone's alternative view and think about it and respond on the merits. And, you know, it's easier for judges to do it because we're operating under a set of rules. It's harder in open society when you don't have those rules. But I still think it's a lesson that's everybody could learn from.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And boy, we sure need it. We sure need it today.
We do.
Nobody listens to anybody.
That's my impression as well. Maybe this isn't a fair question, but just to jump, do you think being blind has made you a better listener? Or were you always a great listener?
I don't know the answer there. I told you I resolved a lot of questions when I wrote the book. I don't actually think I know the answer to that one.
It might not be a fair question.
I think the answer is probably not. I think being a good listener has to do with, I grew up I remember I spent, in my home, my parents' home, sitting around the dining room table. My parents were deeply involved in the community, and we talked and listened. I learned there. I went to two great universities where I learned to listen to other views. I think it's just in my DNA. Doesn't have anything to do with my eyesight.
Yeah. Can you talk more about your background? I know you've said that you came from sort of two very different Jewish backgrounds, one from each parent.
Right. Yeah. Yes. I grew up in the 40s and 50s in Silver Spring, Maryland. My father was a physicist, very secular Jew. My mother, was a homemaker and community activist, and a very observant Jew. She grew up in a in an Orthodox Jewish family in Lakewood, New Jersey. And I always thought my parents had a deal. They never told me that. But I think the deal was that my mother, Molly, David would go to Hebrew school and have a bar mitzvah and do all those things. But when he was 13, he was entitled, this was my father's deal, to make his own decision about what he wanted to do. And I think that was their deal. So yes, I grew up in a Jewish household, but and I did go to synagogue and had a bar mitzvah. But when I became 13, I made the decision to go more in my dad's direction. He was a scientist. I was in that, and I've always, I am Jewish, and I care very much about the values of Judaism. But and I don't think my mother was particularly disappointed. I think she was proud of what I became, even though I didn't go to services regularly.
And
that's because I got my values from my parents. That's where they came from, and those are Jewish values. So
yeah, no, and you've maintained a connection to the community. You have you had a story about well, first of all, I remember I encountered you at one point memorably at Adas Israel, where you were judging a moot court in which oldest son was trying to argue some kind of case.
Yeah, but he did a really good job, Amy.
Well, thank you. I should hope so. Why else would I bring it up? But you seem to be. I mean, you've been very active in speaking at synagogues and other places like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
I've talked to several of the local synagogues, and next month I'll be at Or Kodesh, where I had my bar mitzvah. Then it was called Montgomery County Jewish Community Center.
No, really? Or Kodesh?
MCJC. Yeah.
Didn't know that. Must have undergone some changes. So you had a story, you mentioned to me a story earlier about how you discovered what Leviticus says about being blind, about people with disabilities. Is that?
Yeah. So during the writing process, I thought, gee, I should figure out what the Old Testament says about blindness. So I called up our dear friend Lauren Holtzblatt, the rabbi at Adas Israel, and I told her I'd like to learn about this. And so she invited us in for the morning. Edie and I went together, and we spent the morning. She had selected some texts for us to read, and we learned that in Leviticus it says that thou shalt not place stumbling blocks in the way of the blind, and that means not just things you can trip over, but other obstacles. That there's an obligation to remove obstacles. And I write about this in the book because when we were finished, I had to go to the courthouse, and Edie was going home, and so we called a lift, and the lift showed up. And what happened to me at that moment is what happens to huge numbers of blind people with guide dogs. The driver wouldn't let us in the car. And he yelled and screamed at us and said he wouldn't take the dog. And my dear wife tried to explain to him that, this was a trained guide dog, and that it was his legal obligation to carry the dog. And he really went nuts. It was actually, it was embarrassing. It was demeaning. Vixen and I were in the car. If you open a car door, Vixen hops in. She already got in. So finally we gave up, and I went back to the courthouse. But the first thing I did when I got home is I called a reporter at your old newspaper. And 1 week later, there was a banner headline in the Post with a great picture of Vixen saying, Lyft driver refuses to take federal judge with his guide dog.
Good for you.
Yeah. Well, it didn't do any good. Lyft was upset. They sent some people to see me. They did nothing about it. This is a real problem for blind people. And, I was with my wife. So, it wasn't a tragedy, but many blind people, when they call Lyft to go to the airport, they're alone. Right. And these guys, they just drive by. When they see they're blind, they won't stop.
Wow.
And Lyft and Uber won't do anything about it. They claim they do. And their websites are very clear that drivers are supposed to carry guide dogs, but they don't enforce it. At least not that I'm aware of.
That's
So,
really, that's
yeah,
shocking. I really,
it
that's just
is.
one of a
Yeah.
million little things that people
Yeah. Well, last summer we went to San Francisco and one of our grandsons took us into the city and we rode in a Waymo, a self-driving car.
right,
Now,
right.
you don't have that problem there. This Waymo won't reject your guide dog.
That's the first decent, good thing I've heard about the self-driving car.
Yeah, right.
Wow. Well, and you survived the experience, so the
Yeah.
Waymo
Oh,
must,
it was great. It's our
yeah,
future.
that's interesting. So actually that's another good segue. Part of one of the stories, one of the through lines in the book that's kind of wondrous is has to do with the various technologies
Yeah,
that have come along that have been developed at different points in your
right,
lifetime to
right.
help the visually impaired. Um, can you talk about that a little bit? Do you think, I mean, what are you do talk about this in the book, but some of them, what are the great leaps forward that have been helpful? Like what kind of technology do you?
The biggest leap forward was technology has made a huge difference in my life. I mean, I'd still rather not be blind, but the fact is, if you have to be blind, it's a lot better now than it was 30, 40 years ago. And that's because the world went digital
Mm,
and text to speech technology. Here, I'll give you an example. When I started as a judge on the DC Circuit in 1994, I had a full time reader in addition to my 4 law clerks, plus a
mm,
half-time reader to work in the evenings and on weekends. And those 2 young people read everything that came across my desk, letters, cases, memos, everything. And they read all day long, the whole day. In my
wow.
last year on the court, I no longer needed a backup reader. I still had a full-time reader, and she probably read to me less than 5% of the time. And that's because with the technology that's available, I can now read most anything myself. I mean, for example, I was the other day when the Supreme Court decided the case involving the Tennessee law that limits medical treatment for transgender children.
Mm, mm,
10 years ago, for me to read that, I would have had to call up my office, get a law clerk or my reader to find the case and read it to me.
right.
All I had to do when this came down was have someone, a legal assistant or even a secretary, just email me the opinion. And I could read it in my iPhone, just
Huh.
like anybody else can, or I have this Braille computer that's why I have a headset on that I can hear it. So I can read almost everything now on my own, which is fabulous because the gold standard, at least for this blind person, is being as independent as I can to do things that I don't need help on.
Mhm.
And, I love the freedom that this stuff gives me. I get up in the morning, I read the papers all by myself. No one has to read them to me.
Wow.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. And that's been only when did that come in a serious way? Like 10 years, 5 years?
yeah, I'd say in the past 10 years, it's just blossomed. The technology is getting better and better. The voices are better and better. And there's more and more material uh, that's available. So it's a completely different world now than it was 50 years ago, 60 years ago.
Right. So when you started losing your vision in a sort of significant way in your
Yeah.
sort of in your 30s, you couldn't anticipate any of these
No,
ameliorations.
but you know what I did have, Amy? This was really important to us that, I've always been a big reader.
Mm,
And at about the time I was losing my sight and having harder and harder time reading. And at that point we had little children and I was reading books, bedtime stories to my kids. We discovered talking books at the Library of Congress, which have been around since the New Deal, basically. There are
really?
hundreds of thousands of recorded books at the Library of Congress available to people with visual disabilities. So I started using them at that point. This was when I was in my mid 30s, and it allowed me to return to reading
Mm,
books, novels, biographies, and most important, I could read with my kids because, I would get a recorded version of Goodnight Moon and the chair with my little girls and listen to Goodnight Moon while they looked at the print. So you know, recorded books were the beginning of the revolution for me. They were great.
And that was partly the luck of being in the proximity of the Library of Congress, right?
Actually, they're available all over the country.
Oh, they are. Oh.
Yeah, they're available through local libraries. When I started using them, they came on big records. They came in a box in the mail.
Oh, like an LP.
Yeah, and you had a record
Wow.
player.
Sure.
And then over the years, they went from records to reel tapes to cassette tapes to CDs, and now I can download them wirelessly right into my machine.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah,
And
it's amazing.
on the occasions I've heard you speak in public, like even in the moot court,
Yeah,
you had this little almost invisible flat type little recording type device
yeah,
that kept in your hand or, in your
right.
cuff almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Well,
that,
that's what when I read you that quote from the book, I was using this computer, which I have this headset on, and I'm able to, somebody who uses a teleprompter is looking at the text, right, and speaking it. Well, this is my audio teleprompter. It's got it's got it in there, and I'm the only difference between me and someone using a teleprompter is that the person using a teleprompter is getting the information through her eyes, and I'm getting mine through my ears, but they're working exactly the same way. They're all ending up in our brain, and we're repeating them. So it doesn't really, it's the technology that makes a difference. The mental process is the same.
Right. Sounds straightforward. You mentioned, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, you mentioned how, what a pleasure it is to become, what a pleasure it was to be able to read independently and not have to rely on anyone. And I know you like to talk about your dog. So that seems like a segue. Taking on the relationship with your dog made you also much more independent, right?
Oh, yes. Well, I tell the story in the book in the last chapter. It's called The Dog That Changed My Life. And that's not an overstatement. I never planned to get a dog. I was pretty good using a mobility cane, but one day one of our grandsons, who was then 11, showed up at our house with a podcast about guide dogs and how they're trained, and kind of a light bulb went off, and I talked to Edie about it. And to make a long story short, we applied. Applying to get a guide dog, Amy, is like applying to college.
Wow.
You need references, and they do home visits. It's really quite rigorous. But fortunately for us, we succeeded. I was accepted, and about 5.5 years ago, the Fidelco Guide Dog Foundation in Connecticut, which trains only German Shepherds, showed up with this beautiful 2-year-old German Shepherd named Vixen. And she's really changed my life because she's given me just a huge amount of, she's given both Edie and me a huge amount of independence. I love to go on long walks, and Vixen and I can now go by ourselves. Or when I go to the courthouse, or now to the law firm, we take the metro together. So we can do things. And, the other thing about it is that, I talked at the beginning of our discussion about how profound writing the book was in my willingness to accept and talk about blindness. Well, Vixen played an important role in that, because you can't have a guide dog and not talk about blindness. People want to talk about the dog. People actually, when I'm standing on the metro, someone will say, "Excuse me, but is that dog going to really how's that dog going to get you out of here?" Or, "There's some busy streets up there. Are you going to get across those streets?" Or, "How did she get trained?" Or, "Where did you get her?" So people love to talk about the dog, and she I say in the book, dogs bring people together, and guide dogs especially bring people together.
Well, that's sweet. Did you, I might have run over this. Was there a part of the prologue you wanted to read out loud?
Sure.
Because you went back to talking about how the book, was
Yeah.
such a profound
This is-
experience. I feel like we rolled right over it.
Yeah, that would be okay. There's a sort of a couple of sentences here from the prologue, which I hope will give our listeners a really good sense of the book, of its two, I call them threads: blindness and justice. And see, I'm using this machine right now. I'm just pushing this button and hearing this, and I'll repeat it just as if someone using a teleprompter were reading what they saw. Okay, I've lived a rich and varied life as a civil rights lawyer, as a federal judge, as a husband of 60 years, as a father of 4, as a grandfather of 8, and now as a great-grandfather. I've spent my professional career in the pursuit of justice, and I could have written a memoir entirely about that pursuit. But unlike most lawyers and judges, I've been blind for over half my life due to a rare inherited eye disease called retinitis pigmentosa. Throughout my 30 years on the nation's second highest court, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, known as the DC Circuit, I could neither read a word of the thousands of legal briefs submitted to my court, nor see the faces of the hundreds of lawyers who argued before me. A blind judge sounds like a cliche, I know, but like the statue of Lady Justice wearing a blindfold and holding her scales. But it's no cliche to me. I can't see, but I can listen closely. I didn't need to see the lawyers to hear their arguments, and I absorbed all the written materials by having it read to me or later by using digital audio devices. For decades, I fooled myself into thinking that my blindness was irrelevant to my work and my worth. Only now, in my 80s, and in writing this memoir, have I finally come to accept my blindness as an essential part of who I am. This memoir is about my life in the law and my journey into blindness. It's also about the Supreme Court and my grave concern about the state of our judiciary. That's the book.
Yeah, no, it's a prologue that definitely captures it.
I
It's
hope people like it. Yeah.
yeah, no, I think, and I do, I do think that in a lot of ways you braid these themes in a very interesting way.
Well, I just thank you, Amy. And I just go on to say to your listeners that prologue goes on to describe a death penalty case that I heard a few years ago, and I use it to explain my concerns about the court, and also Vixen plays a major role in it.
Right. Yeah, no, it captures
Yeah.
everything. Is that
Right.
the one somewhere in there you talk about needing to read 15,000 pages of material for a case? That seems like a lot for.
It was a lot. That was one of the environmental cases. That was actually a case called Massachusetts against EPA, which was a big climate change case that the Supreme Court heard 15 years ago, and where the court held that EPA had to regulate carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And it's as a result of that decision that the EPA issued all of its greenhouse gas regulations that the Trump administration is now repealing.
Right.
Oh, it's in that case that I had to read a huge record. The other one that's actually 15,000 pages exactly was the voting rights case, which was Shelby County versus Holder, and that was 15,000 pages of congressional record. Now, I did read all of it, but I had law clerks who helped organize it for me, and a lot of it I skimmed, but I actually did read the record. You had to decide the case. I'm afraid the Supreme Court didn't read it.
Well, that's the point of your opening anecdote, right? Is you guys rush to really get a grip on the material, and send the Supreme Court this reasoned explanation for why they need to send it back to the lower court, and they just go no.
Right. Yep.
It's well, it's I guess that's reading the record is a variation on listening, right? I mean,
yes, but it's also critical to judging because the lawsuits have facts, and the facts are critical to deciding the case. And appeals courts get their facts either from the agency or the district court, not from any place else. And so a judge can't really decide a case without first mastering the facts. I had great law clerks. I had 4 a year for 30 years. And the first thing I tell them, first piece of advice was, you have to master the facts of the case before you do anything else.
So I had one more thing in the book that I wanted to sort of ask you about. Point two. There are a few questions. There's a very striking episode at the beginning of your career at Hogan, I guess then Hogan Hartson, where you say for the first time you're experiencing this progressive
Yeah,
ailment, and you finally go, you say, well, I for once I'll just say it, and you say to the person hiring you, or maybe interviewing you, I'm not sure how much longer I'll be able to see. And instead of all the things you're fearing, he says, what kind of help do you need?
right.
Just
Yeah,
like that. And I just
yeah.
thought that was a very interesting. Has that been typical of your experience once you became sort of,
Well,
you know?
well, first of all, it's in a chapter called Turning Points
Hmm.
because it was a big turning point. I mean, as I say in there, the partner he didn't ask me what the problem was or why, or I say he didn't even seem to feel sorry for me. He just wanted to know what help I needed. And I, I'd say two things about that. One is, in many ways, it's among, I think, the most important passages in the book, because I hope that hiring partners in law firms or people hire anywhere will read that and realize that if they're interviewing a bunch of people and one of them happens to have a disability, that they just hire on the basis of the merit and find out what the person needs to do their job. That's what the law requires, but it's also what they should do. The other thing I learned from that, I mean, I had, as you could tell from the excerpt I read, I hid my blindness as long as I could. And even when it was obvious that I was having visual problems, I didn't talk about it, and people didn't talk to me about it. I mean, the lesson from that is it's best to be honest and disclose.
Mm.
Everybody's better off. I would have been better off if I had been more honest earlier, and people who hire or other institutions are better off and better able to accommodate disabilities if they understand what the disability is.
Mhm.
So, the book is one of the themes in the book, I guess, is acknowledgement, acceptance, disclosure. Yeah.
Mm. You say that you've gotten a tremendous outpouring of response from people
Yeah.
dealing with disabilities in their own lives. Is that, have you been counseling people along those lines? Do they ask you? I mean, aside from the book, do they ask you for advice? Do you know?
Well, yes. Yes. I mean, I'm trying. I don't do a lot of it, but sure. Particularly law students who write to me who are losing their
Mm.
sight. I've tried to help them, but mostly people haven't asked for help. They've just wanted to share their experience. They share with me through these emails and at book talks. It's not unusual for, during the book talk or afterwards, someone comes up to Edie and says,
Mm.
gosh, I really like the book. And by the way, I've been hiding something all my life. So
Huh.
Edie's heard as much of this as I have. It's really been a revelation for us, Amy. It's something I did not know. So,
That's really
and
interesting.
I wouldn't know it if I hadn't written the book.
That's so interesting, right? You find it out by writing the
Yeah,
book.
right.
Uh, another lesson. You talk in the book a lot about how you had to go back and even learn things about your own about your marriage. You and Edie had to talk about things in the
Right,
book about how your
right.
blindness. Um, do you want to talk about that at all? Is there?
Well, I'm the one who's blind, but Edie has been living with a blind person for 60 years. And so blindness affects hers in many ways as it does me, just differently.
Mhm.
And we spent a huge amount of time writing this book, talking about that. We even learned a whole lot about our children. We when the first draft of my editor says to me, he says, you've got to write about your kids.
Hmm.
So I write this thing about how difficult it was for the kids. But then we decided we have 4 adult children. They all have their own children. They're great kids. And so we decided, we sent them a questionnaire. I think it had 10 questions called Growing Up with a Blind Dad. And we asked them 10 questions, and they all responded with memos. They sent us emails. And when you see a quote from one of the children in the book, it's from those memos. But what we learned from that, and again, we wouldn't have known this had we not written the book, was that, to our children, having a blind dad was kind of normal.
Mm-hmm.
That was their life. They, one of the stories I tell in there is that when young Rebecca was off in a carpool with another family, she came home and said, I didn't know dads drove cars. She just, it was,
Oh, right.
and, Stephanie, I tell a story about Stephanie. She and I went off on a backpacking trip in the Rattlesnake Range in Montana. And it was just Stephanie and me. And, she writes in the memo that what really scared her on the trip was the lightning. She didn't say anything about worrying about her father. That was just natural to go hiking with a blind dad. And so that's something we learned writing the book, So anyway, that's, it's one of the many things that we became to understand through the writing process.
An interesting lesson.
I'm not going to write another book, but if I ever did, I'd write a book about writing a memoir.
I love it. That would make a great blurb,
Maybe just an article someday.
Right. You can. Well, I'll start sending you memoirs to review.
Oh, please.
So before we wrap up, there are a couple of questions that came in that are interesting. One reader says she starts by saying that her mother also had she calls it RP. Yeah,
RP.
And was an advocate for the blind in the 70s and 80s.
Oh.
And based on that, she wants to know, where did you learn to do Braille and labeling? And, did you have to go to rehab centers, or I know the dog came to you, but what about all these other kids?
Learn is not exactly the right word. In my mid-30s, when I was at the Lawyers Committee, my sight took a dramatic downward thing, and I couldn't read anymore. I started using my secretary to read to me, and I decided I was going to learn Braille. And I can't remember how we found this woman. Her name was Bertha. I was at that point working at 15th Street and 15th and H, and she lived in a little apartment in Langley Park, and she had a guide dog named Tanya. And so I would go out there twice a week and sit in her kitchen, and she taught me Braille. Now, that's why I say learn is kind of the wrong word, because I can read it letter by letter, but I'm not a Braille reader. I wish I was, but I'm not. I can read it letter by letter. But the important thing is that I did learn to type Braille. And because of that, I can use these Braille typewriters. So I'm really glad I did that. But I didn't go to a rehab center or anything like that. I just found Bertha.
So just you picked things as you needed them. You learned them as they.
Right. Same thing with learning to use my cane. I didn't want to do that. That's a huge step. I didn't want to do it. And I certainly didn't want to go to the Lighthouse for the Blind to do it, because I didn't think I was a blind person. But fortunately, Edie noticed there was a blind tap dancer at our community center, the one up at Connecticut Avenue and Connecticut and Western. There's a community center and a library there. There's a blind tap dancer. And so Edie asked her if she would teach me, and she did. We would go to her.
A blind tap dancer?
Yeah.
I
And
didn't know that.
she didn't teach me tap dancing. She taught me how to use a cane.
Wow. Well, tapping, right.
In fact, a funny story about that is, so when I applied for a guide dog, I had to have a certificate. They wanted a certificate of where I learned who taught me cane travel, but I didn't have one. So in order to get the guide dog, I had to get a trainer from the Lighthouse to come to the courthouse and watch me for a couple of days and certify me as someone who I had been using a cane for 40 years.
Wow.
So I had to get certified.
Did you pass?
I don't blame them for doing it, because you can't use a guide dog unless you're extremely aware of where you are. I mean, the guide dog and the person are called a team for a good reason, which is we each have responsibilities. And my responsibility, the human's responsibility, is to have a sense of where you are. The dog is extremely good at navigating, but you need to know where you are.
Interesting. All right. We have time for one more question. I know you have a hard stop, and it's 5:27.
Okay.
But one questioner wants to know, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, I think, about the law and idealism. Would you recommend to a college student today that they go into the law? And if so,
Yes.
What are the good areas?
Absolutely. I mean, we need good lawyers now more. We need good lawyers now more than ever. The only hope we have, at least in the legal system, for maintaining it, is really, really good lawyers who know how to argue cases and win cases and even lose cases, which is what we're going to do. But if lawyers walk away, we're really in trouble. That's why it's so dangerous what Trump has done with the big law firms. You know, he's taken a lot of valuable pro bono work off the field. And so we need really good lawyers, and many of them. So, and I also think, you know, lawyers can accomplish a lot. Not every lawyer is going to argue in the Supreme Court. And you can do a lot for individuals as a lawyer in the lower courts, in the state courts. Just the other day, I spoke to the people at the Legal Services Corporation. They have hundreds of lawyers across the country representing poor people and doing really important work in our country. So yes, they should go to law school, but only if they want to. I mean, you know, not everybody should go to law school, but don't not go to law school because of what you're reading in the papers. Go to law school because of what you're reading in the papers.
That's great. That's a great inspirational note. Thank you. An up note to end on after really the whole thing, so the whole story. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us and in the book. And it's great to talk to you, Judge. And I'm going to pass it back to Suzanne to wrap up.
Well,
But
Amy, thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation. Great.
likewise, thank you so
Look
much.
forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, and I echo, thank you, Judge Tatel. Thank you, Amy, for this really inspiring conversation. I wanted to let people know again, the book is called Vision, a Memoir of Blindness and Justice. I put a link in the chat. It's a very inspiring book. You should all go out and read it. And I will send a follow-up email to everybody so you will have it there as well. Please visit momentmag.com where you can register for our upcoming programs. Tomorrow, one on Israel. Next week, a program, later in the week, a program with CNN's Van Jones. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.